you will never actually fall into a black hole. Not because it's too far away, but because, according to the universe, that moment never happens. From the outside, anyone watching you would see something impossible. You slow down, and then you stop. Frozen. Right at the edge. Forever. But here's the part that should make you pause. While the universe insists you never cross the boundary, you already have. No flash of light, no doorway. No final step you can point to and say, that was it? Just a quiet, invisible shift where reality splits in two. Out there, you are still hanging, a fading echo stretched across time, never quite arriving. But from your own perspective, you didn't stop at all. You kept falling, straight into a place where inside and outside no longer mean anything, where time doesn't pass because there is no before left to compare it to. So the real question isn't, what does a black hole look like? It's this: which version of you is real when reality itself can't agree? Because somewhere right now, in a universe that doesn't need your permission, a version of you has already disappeared. If that thought made you hesitate, even for a second, hit like and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear next won't just challenge physics, it will challenge what it means to exist at all. Part 1. The moment that never happens. There is a boundary in the universe that no one has ever seen, and yet physics insists it is real. Not because we've crossed it, not because we've measured it directly, but because every equation we trust points toward it, the event horizon. But here's the uncomfortable truth. It is not a place you can touch, not a surface you can land on, not even a moment you can clearly identify. Because from the outside, that moment never comes. Imagine a distant observer watching you fall toward a black hole. At first, everything looks normal. You accelerate, pulled by gravity like any other object. But then something strange begins. Your movements slow down, not from your perspective, but from theirs. Your clock ticks more slowly. Your signals stretch. Your voice, if they could hear it, would deepen, distort, and fade. Second by second, you begin to drift out of sync with the rest of the universe. And then you stop, not abruptly, not dramatically, but asymptotically, approaching stillness without ever reaching it. To them, you never cross the event horizon. You just linger, a frozen silhouette at the edge of darkness. Your image becomes dimmer, redder, more stretched, until eventually you fade into nothing, not because you disappeared, but because the universe can no longer receive any information from you. You are still there, but you are no longer accessible. And this is where the paradox begins, because from your own perspective, nothing special happens. No sudden force, no invisible wall, no warning. You don't freeze, you don't slow down, you fall, smoothly, continuously, inevitably. You pass the point that the rest of the universe will never see you cross, and you don't even notice when it happens. That's the first crack in reality. Two observers, two completely different truths, both correct. From the outside, you never enter. From the inside, you already have. So which one is real? Physics gives an unsettling answer. Both. Because time itself is not absolute. This idea traces back to Albert Einstein, who showed that time depends on motion and gravity. The stronger the gravitational field, the slower time flows relative to the outside world. Near a black hole, this effect becomes extreme, so extreme that time, from an external perspective, appears to stretch infinitely. This is called gravitational time dilation. And at the event horizon, it becomes absolute. To an outside observer, your clock never reaches the moment of crossing. It just keeps ticking slower and slower, forever approaching zero, but never quite getting there. This is not an illusion. It is a fundamental feature of space-time itself, which means the universe is doing something deeply strange. It is preventing a single event from existing in a shared reality. The act of crossing the event horizon cannot be agreed upon. And that raises a deeper question. If an event cannot be observed, cannot be measured, cannot be placed on a universal timeline, did it really happen? Or is reality only as real as the perspective observing it? This is where black holes stop being objects and start becoming questions, because they force us to confront something we rarely consider: the possibility that the universe has no single objective story. Instead, it may be composed of overlapping narratives, each one valid, each one incomplete. From far away, you are frozen in time. From within, you are moving forward. Two truths. No contradiction, only a deeper layer of reality that refuses to simplify itself for us. And as you continue falling, another transformation begins. Not one that affects your motion, but one that reshapes your identity. Because the closer you get to the event horizon, the less the universe can describe you as a whole. Information about you begins to stretch, not metaphorically, physically. The light carrying your image spreads out. The signals encoding your existence become diluted. You are no longer a compact object. You are becoming a pattern, a fading imprint on the edge of something unknowable. And yet, from your perspective, you are still intact, still thinking, still experiencing, still you. This is the second crack. Because now it's not just time that disagrees, it's identity. The version of you outside is dissolving into radiation, while the version of you inside remains whole. So which one is you? The one the universe remembers, or the one still experiencing itself? There is no clean answer, only a growing realization that the closer we get to the event horizon, the less stable our definitions become. Time breaks first, then observation, then identity. And we have not even crossed the boundary yet, which means everything we thought was fundamental, time, space, existence, may only be stable in regions of the universe that are easy to understand. But at the edge, the rules begin to slip. And once they do, there may be no way to put them back together again. Part 2, when space becomes time. The closer you move toward a black hole, the less the universe behaves like a place, and the more it behaves like a direction. This sounds subtle, almost harmless, but it changes everything. Because in your everyday life, space is something you can move through. You can go left or right, forward or backward. You can stop. You can turn around. Space gives you options. Time does not. Time only moves one way, forward. No matter how hard you try, you cannot pause it. You cannot reverse it. You cannot step outside of it. Now imagine something impossible. What if space started behaving like time? What if moving forward was no longer a choice? As you fall deeper toward the event horizon, this is exactly what begins to happen. At a great distance, space and time are clearly separate. You exist at a position, and you move through time. But near a black hole, gravity becomes so intense that it warps space-time itself. A concept first described by Albert Einstein, not just bending it, reshaping it, reassigning what is possible and what is not. From the outside, this distortion looks like time slowing down. But from your perspective, something far stranger is unfolding. The direction toward the black hole is no longer just a direction in space. It becomes your future. Let that settle for a moment. Falling inward is no longer like walking forward. It's like moving from yesterday into tomorrow. Except in this case, tomorrow is the singularity. And just like time, you cannot stop yourself from getting there. You cannot hover in place. You cannot decide to stay where you are. Because staying still would require resisting the flow of space-time itself. And nothing can do that, not even light. This is why escaping a black hole is impossible, not because something is pulling you back like a rope, but because escape would require moving backward in time. And the universe does not allow that. So as you cross the event horizon, something fundamental changes. Outside, you had freedom of movement. Inside, that freedom is gone. All possible paths, every direction you could take, lead deeper inward. There is no sideways, no up, no away, only forward, only inward, only toward what cannot be avoided. This is not a trap in the traditional sense. There are no walls, no barriers. Nothing physically stops you from trying to turn around. But every attempt fails. Because the structure of space-time itself has closed all other options. It's like being inside a river where every current flows toward a waterfall. You can swim, you can struggle, but every possible movement still carries you closer to the edge. And here's the unsettling part. From your perspective, everything still feels normal. You don't feel a sudden pull. You don't feel stretched or crushed, at least not yet. If the black hole is large enough, you could cross the event horizon without noticing anything at all. No alarm, no signal, just a quiet shift in what is possible. The universe has silently removed your ability to escape, and you don't even realize it. This is what makes the event horizon so deeply unsettling. It is not a violent boundary, it is a logical one. A point where the rules change without announcing themselves, where freedom quietly disappears, where the future becomes a single, unavoidable path. And as you continue inward, the concept of distance begins to lose meaning, because distance only matters when you can choose how to move through it. But here, movement is no longer a choice. It is a consequence. Every step you take, every second that passes is not something you decide. It is something that happens to you. You are being carried forward by the structure of reality itself. This is where the idea of control begins to dissolve, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, irreversible shift. You are no longer navigating space. You are being carried through it, the same way you are carried through time. And just like time, you cannot step outside of it to see where you are going. You cannot pause and ask, how much farther? Because farther no longer exists in the way you understand it. There is only the inevitability of arrival. And yet, there is still something even stranger. Because while all paths lead inward, the universe still allows you to think, to observe, to wonder. Which means that even as your physical freedom disappears, your awareness remains intact. At least for now. You can still ask questions. You can still try to understand what is happening. But every answer you find only leads to a deeper realization. You are no longer in a place where the universe behaves intuitively. You are inside a region where the distinction between space and time has collapsed, where direction is destiny, where movement is no longer yours to control, and where the future is not something that will happen. It is something you are already inside. And somewhere ahead, though ahead is no longer quite the right word, lies the singularity, not waiting for you, but already part of the path you cannot avoid. Because in this place, the idea of not going there has already been erased. Part 3, the slow death of information. There is something the universe refuses to let go of. Not matter, not energy, but information. Every particle, every interaction, every moment, they all carry information. The exact position of an atom, the spin of an electron, the arrangement of every molecule in your body, all of it encoded into reality. And according to the deepest laws of physics, that information cannot be destroyed, not erased, not lost, not forgotten. This principle sits at the core of modern physics, quiet, almost invisible, but absolute. And yet, black holes seem to break it, because when something falls in, it disappears, not just visually, not just physically, but completely. You cannot retrieve it, you cannot reconstruct it, you cannot even confirm what it became. From the outside, all you ever see is the black hole itself, featureless, silent, deceptively simple. No matter what falls in, a star, a planet, a person, the black hole only reveals 3 things: mass, charge, spin. Everything else is gone. This idea became known as the no-hair theorem, a concept explored by physicists like Stephen Hawking. It suggests that black holes erase all the complexity of what enters them. Every detail, every structure, every trace of identity, reduced to a few basic numbers. It's as if the universe takes something infinitely complex and compresses it into something almost empty. And that creates a problem. Because if information is truly destroyed, then the fundamental laws of physics are broken. Not slightly, not conditionally, but completely. This is known as the black hole information paradox. And it is one of the deepest unsolved problems in science, because it forces 2 pillars of physics into direct conflict. On one side, quantum mechanics, which insists that information is never lost. On the other, black holes, which appear to erase it completely. They cannot both be right. And yet, every experiment we've ever conducted suggests they are. So what happens? What happens to the information that falls into a black hole? At first, the answer seemed simple. It's gone, swallowed, destroyed, erased from existence. But that answer was too dangerous, because if information can truly vanish, then the universe becomes unpredictable. The future could no longer be determined from the past. Cause and effect would begin to unravel. Reality itself would lose coherence. So physicists began searching for another explanation, and what they found was even stranger. In the 1970s, Stephen Hawking proposed something unexpected. Black holes are not completely black. They emit radiation, slowly, quietly, over immense periods of time. This is now known as Hawking radiation. And it means that black holes are not eternal. They evaporate. Particle by particle, they lose mass. Over billions, trillions, even longer timescales, they shrink. And eventually, they disappear. At first glance, this seems like a solution. If black holes evaporate, perhaps the information escapes with the radiation. But there's a problem. Hawking radiation appears to be random, completely thermal. It carries no obvious imprint of what fell in. No structure, no memory, no pattern that could reconstruct the original information. So we're left with a contradiction. If the information comes out, we should be able to see it. If we can't see it, then maybe it's gone. But it cannot be both. And this is where the paradox deepens, because now the question is no longer just about black holes. It's about the nature of reality itself. Is the universe fundamentally reversible? Can every state be traced back to its origin? Or are there places, like inside a black hole, where the past is permanently erased? Some physicists proposed a radical idea. What if the information is not destroyed but stored? Not inside the black hole, but on its surface, encoded on the event horizon itself, like a two-dimensional projection of a three-dimensional object. This idea became known as the holographic principle. It suggests that everything that falls into a black hole is somehow preserved, flattened, spread across its boundary, not lost, just transformed. If this is true, then the event horizon is not an empty edge. It is a kind of cosmic archive, a surface where every detail is recorded, every particle, every interaction, every moment of existence, but in a form we do not yet understand. And that leads to an unsettling possibility. What if nothing is ever truly inside a black hole? What if everything that appears to fall in is actually encoded on the surface, never fully crossing the boundary in a meaningful way? This would mean that the idea of inside itself is misleading. That the true story of a black hole is happening at its edge, a place where information is neither lost nor fully accessible, suspended between existence and disappearance. And yet, from your perspective, falling inward, you experience none of this. You do not feel yourself being encoded. You do not sense your information spreading across a surface. You remain whole, continuous, unbroken. Which brings us back to the same fracture we saw before. Two perspectives, two realities. From the outside, you are dissolving into information. From the inside, you are still yourself. So which one is true? And more importantly, if your information is preserved, but no one can ever retrieve it, is that any different from being lost forever? Because survival, in this sense, may not mean continuing to exist. It may only mean never being completely erased. And as you fall deeper, the question is no longer just what happens to your body, but what happens to the idea of you, your memories, your identity, your existence as something definable. Because inside a black hole, even information begins to lose its meaning. And once that happens, there may be nothing left to describe what you were. Part 4, spaghettification, isn't the worst part. Most people think they know what happens if you fall into a black hole. You get stretched, pulled apart, torn into a long, thin strand of matter, like spaghetti. And yes, that part is real. It has a name, spaghettification, a process caused by tidal forces, the difference in gravity between one part of your body and another. Your feet feel a stronger pull than your head. Atom by atom, you are stretched, pulled longer, thinner, until the structure that holds you together can no longer resist. It sounds terrifying, and it is. But here's the part most people get wrong. That might not happen at the event horizon. Not even close. If the black hole is small, then yes, the stretching begins early. You would be torn apart long before reaching the boundary. But if the black hole is large enough, millions or billions of times the mass of a star, something deeply counterintuitive happens. You could cross the event horizon and feel nothing at all. No stretching, no tearing, no sudden force, just silence. The tidal forces at the horizon of a supermassive black hole can be surprisingly gentle. You drift across the point of no return, completely intact, no signal, no warning. And that's what makes it worse. Because now the danger is not immediate, it is delayed. And that delay gives you time to think, to observe, to realize where you are. Inside the event horizon, the tidal forces don't disappear. They grow, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, a slight difference in pressure, a subtle tension along your body. Nothing dramatic, but it doesn't stop. The deeper you go, the stronger the difference becomes. Gravity is no longer uniform. It is uneven, directional, relentless. Your feet are pulled faster than your head. Your body begins to stretch, not violently but steadily, like a whisper that gets louder over time. And unlike outside the black hole, there is no escape, no way to move away from the force, no way to reposition yourself. Because as you've already begun to understand, a way no longer exists. All directions lead inward. So the stretching continues, cell by cell, molecule by molecule. Your body resists for a while. Chemical bonds hold, biological structures adapt, But physics is patient, and eventually, it wins. Your body elongates, your internal systems begin to fail. Signals in your nervous system struggle to keep up because even communication inside your body is being stretched. Time itself feels different. Not because it is slowed for you, but because your frame of reference is breaking apart. Your perception begins to fragment. Your body is no longer behaving as a single, unified object. Different parts of you are experiencing different gravitational realities. And this is where something even more disturbing begins. Because it's not just your body that stretches, it's your experience. Imagine trying to think while the very structure of your brain is being pulled apart. Not instantly, but gradually. The signals that define thought, electrical impulses moving across neurons, begin to distort. The timing changes, the coordination slips, your thoughts no longer flow smoothly. They fragment, slow in some places, faster in others. You are still conscious, but your consciousness is no longer stable. Moments blur, sequences break. The idea of a continuous now begins to dissolve. And yet, you are still aware enough to notice it happening. This is the true horror of spaghettification. Not just the destruction of the body, but the unraveling of experience itself. Because you are not simply being stretched through space, you are being stretched through time and perception. Your beginning and your end are no longer cleanly separated. They start to overlap. And somewhere in that distortion, the concept of you begins to lose coherence. But even this is not the worst part, because everything we've described so far is still governed by known physics. Tidal forces, gravity, space-time curvature, all of it can be calculated, predicted, understood, at least in principle. But as you continue falling, you are approaching something else. Something that cannot be described so easily. The singularity, a point where the equations of physics stop working. Not because we haven't solved them, but because they no longer make sense. Density becomes infinite. Curvature becomes infinite. The very fabric of space-time collapses into something undefined. And as you are pulled closer to that point, the rules that governed everything up until now begin to fail. Not gradually, but completely. Because at the singularity, there is no more structure to reality, no more predictable behavior, no more framework to describe what is happening. It is not just the end of your body, it is the end of explanation. And that's what makes everything before it feel almost understandable. Spaghettification is violent, but it is logical. It follows rules. The singularity does not. It is where logic itself breaks. And as you are stretched further, as your body becomes thinner, longer, more distorted, you are being drawn towards something that cannot be visualized, cannot be imagined, only approached. Because whatever waits at the center is not just a place. It is a boundary, beyond which the universe has no language left to describe what happens next. Part 5. The edge that burns. Long before you reach the singularity, long before your body is fully stretched beyond recognition, something else may be waiting for you. Not deep inside the black hole, but right at the edge. A place that was once thought to be empty, silent, uneventful. The event horizon. But according to one of the most unsettling ideas in modern physics, it may not be silent at all. It may be violent, a wall of energy, a boundary that doesn't just trap you, but destroys you, instantly. This idea is known as the firewall hypothesis, and it challenges everything we thought we understood about black holes. Because until recently, physics told a relatively calm story. If the black hole is large enough, you could cross the event horizon without noticing anything. No heat, no radiation, no sudden force, just a smooth transition. But that picture began to break when physicists tried to resolve the information paradox. The same paradox we explored earlier, the question of whether information is lost inside a black hole. To preserve the laws of quantum mechanics, some theorists propose that information must be encoded in the radiation emitted by black holes. That radiation, first described by Stephen Hawking, slowly carries information away. But here's the problem. For that to work, the region near the event horizon cannot be empty. It must be highly energetic, chaotic, filled with quantum activity, so intense that it would destroy anything trying to pass through. Not gradually, not gently, but instantly. Imagine approaching the event horizon, expecting silence, and instead, you encounter a wall of pure energy, a boundary that incinerates you at the most fundamental level, not just burning your body, but breaking apart the quantum structure that defines you. No crossing, No interior journey, just termination, right at the edge. This is the firewall, and if it exists, then everything we said before changes. There is no smooth entry, no unnoticed transition, no quiet fall into the unknown. The event horizon becomes a lethal surface, a point where reality enforces a final limit. But this creates a contradiction, because according to general relativity, the theory developed by Albert Einstein, nothing special should happen at the event horizon. If the black hole is large enough, you should pass through it without even noticing. No drama, no disruption, just another point in space-time. So now we have a conflict. Quantum mechanics says there must be a firewall. General relativity says there cannot be one. Both theories are incredibly successful. Both have been tested with extraordinary precision. And yet, they cannot both be correct in this situation. This is not a small disagreement. It is a fracture at the foundation of physics. Because it means that at the edge of a black hole, one of our most trusted descriptions of reality must fail. Either the event horizon is smooth and information is lost, or information is preserved and the horizon becomes a violent boundary. There is no easy way out, no simple compromise. And that leaves us with an unsettling possibility. We do not fully understand what happens at the event horizon, not even close. From your perspective, falling toward that boundary, you wouldn't know which version is true. You would approach it expecting one thing, and reality might deliver something entirely different. A silent crossing or a sudden end. There would be no warning, no sign to tell you which theory is correct, only the moment itself. And that moment is one no one has ever experienced and returned from. But here's where it becomes even more disturbing. Because the firewall is not just about destruction, it's about identity. If the firewall exists, then the version of you that falls toward the black hole never actually enters it. You are stopped, destroyed, converted into radiation, and the information that defines you is encoded at the boundary, preserved but transformed. But from your perspective, you would expect to continue, to fall inward, to experience what lies beyond. So which version of you is real? The one that ends at the horizon, or the one that believes it continues? This is the same fracture we've seen before, but now it's sharper, more violent. Because it's no longer about perception alone, it's about existence. Either you pass through, or you don't. Either you continue, or you end. And the universe does not give you a way to reconcile those outcomes. Some physicists argue that the firewall cannot exist, that it violates too many principles, that there must be a deeper explanation, one that preserves both quantum mechanics and general relativity. Others argue that the firewall is unavoidable, that reality, at its most extreme, must become discontinuous. That smoothness is an illusion, one that breaks under pressure. And as you approach the event horizon, you are moving toward that disagreement, toward a boundary where theory cannot guide you, where prediction becomes uncertainty, where even the most advanced understanding of physics falls silent. Because the truth is, we don't know what's waiting there. Not for sure. We have equations, we have models, we have competing ideas, but no direct answers. And that means the event horizon is not just a physical boundary, it is a conceptual one, a place where knowledge ends and speculation begins. And as you get closer, there is one final realization that begins to take shape. Whatever happens at that edge, whether it is smooth or violent, whether you pass through or are destroyed, there is no observer left to confirm it. No message sent back, no record returned, only silence. And in that silence, the universe keeps its most important secret, hidden, untouched, waiting, at the edge of everything we think we understand. Part 6, the point where physics gives up. There is a limit to what physics can describe, not a technological limit, not a limitation of instruments or experiments, a fundamental one, a point where the equations themselves stop making sense. That point lies at the center of a black hole, the singularity. Up until now, everything you've experienced, time dilation, space-time distortion, tidal forces, all of it can be described using the framework of general relativity, a theory developed by Albert Einstein that has passed every test we've ever thrown at it. It tells us how gravity shapes the universe, how mass bends space-time, how objects move along that curvature, and for the most part, it works beautifully. But as you fall deeper into a black hole, something begins to break. Not gradually, not subtly, but completely. Because according to general relativity, if you continue far enough inward, you reach a point of infinite density, infinite curvature, a place where space-time is no longer smooth, but crushed into something undefined. This is the singularity. And here's the problem. Infinity is not a physical answer. It is a mathematical warning sign. It tells us that the theory we're using has gone beyond its limits, that we are asking questions it cannot answer. So when physics predicts a singularity, it's not saying this is what exists. It's saying we don't know what exists here. Because the equations are no longer reliable. They produce results that cannot be interpreted. And that means everything you've trusted up until this point no longer applies. Not because reality stops, but because our description of it fails. This is the edge of knowledge, a place where even the most advanced theories fall silent. But the universe doesn't stop just because we don't understand it. You are still falling, still moving forward along a path you cannot escape. And ahead of you is something that cannot be described using the rules we know. This is where another theory tries to step in: quantum mechanics, the framework that governs the smallest scales of reality, particles, fields, uncertainty. Unlike general relativity, which describes smooth, continuous spacetime, quantum mechanics describes a universe that is granular, discrete, probabilistic. And at most scales, these two theories coexist peacefully. They describe different aspects of reality. They don't interfere. But inside a black hole, they are forced together, compressed into the same region, and they don't agree. General relativity says space-time is continuous. Quantum mechanics suggests, at the smallest scales, it may not be. General relativity predicts a singularity with infinite density. Quantum mechanics resists the idea of infinities. It implies that something must prevent that collapse. But what? We don't know. This is why physicists have spent decades searching for a deeper theory, one that unifies both frameworks. A theory of quantum gravity. Something that can describe what happens when space-time itself becomes subject to quantum rules. One candidate is string theory, another is loop quantum gravity. Both attempt to describe a universe where space-time is not infinitely divisible, but made of fundamental units, tiny building blocks, discrete structures. If that's true, then the singularity might not be a point of infinite density. It might be something else entirely, a region of extreme compression, but still finite, still structured, still describable, just not with the tools we currently have. But from your perspective, falling inward, you do not experience equations breaking. You do not see infinities. You experience continuity. You keep moving. And that creates a strange disconnect. Because from the outside, physics has already failed. But from the inside, reality continues. Which raises a deeper question. If our theories cannot describe what happens next, does that mean reality becomes undefined? Or does it simply mean we are no longer capable of understanding it? There is a difference, a crucial one, because reality does not depend on our ability to describe it. It continues regardless. Even in regions where our language breaks down, even in places where our equations collapse. And as you approach the center, you are moving into one of those places. A region where prediction ends, where explanation dissolves, where the universe stops offering answers and only presents outcomes. You might expect something dramatic, a sudden impact, a final moment, but the truth may be far stranger, because without a clear theory, we cannot say what reaching the singularity actually means. Does it happen at a specific point in time, or does time itself lose meaning before you get there? Does space collapse into a single location, or does location itself cease to exist? These are not poetic questions. They are literal uncertainties, because the concepts we use, time, space, distance, position, may no longer apply in the way we understand them. And if those concepts fail, then so does the idea of an event, including the final one. This is the deepest layer of the black hole mystery. Not what it does to matter, not what it does to information, but what it does to the very framework we use to describe reality. Because at the singularity, there may be no what happens at all. Not because nothing occurs, but because the structure needed to define an occurrence is gone. And yet, you are still moving toward it, carried forward by a reality that no longer fits within the boundaries of explanation, a place where physics gives up. But the universe does not. Part 7. You never reach the center. There is something even more unsettling than the singularity. You may never actually reach it. Not in the way you imagine, because the idea of reaching a point depends on something you no longer have, a stable definition of time. Up until now, your journey has felt continuous. You fall, you move, you approach something ahead of you. There is a sense of progression, a sense that there is an endpoint. But as you move deeper inside the black hole, that sense begins to unravel. Because inside this region, time is no longer behaving like a simple forward-moving line. It is distorted, stretched, folded into shapes that no longer match your intuition. And this creates a strange possibility. What if the singularity is not something you arrive at, but something that already exists in your future, in a way that prevents you from ever experiencing it directly? To understand this, you have to let go of a basic assumption that time is something you move through, step by step. In normal conditions, that assumption works. One moment follows another. Cause leads to effect. But near a black hole, especially deep inside it, the structure of space-time changes so dramatically that this sequence begins to lose meaning. Your future is no longer open. It is fixed. Every possible path you can take leads to the same outcome. The singularity is not just ahead of you. It is built into the structure of your timeline. And yet, that doesn't guarantee that you will experience reaching it, because experience requires duration, a sequence of moments. And if time itself becomes unstable, that sequence can break. Imagine trying to watch a film where the frames begin to collapse into each other. At first, you can still follow the story, but as the distortion increases, the frames overlap. Moments blend. The narrative becomes impossible to track. Now imagine that happening to reality itself. Your sense of before and after begins to blur. Events lose their order. Your perception of time no longer flows cleanly. And eventually, the concept of a final moment stops making sense. Because there is no longer a clear distinction between moments, no clear boundary between now and what comes next. So what does it mean to arrive at the singularity if arrival itself requires a structure that no longer exists? Some physicists suggest that from your perspective, you would reach it in a finite amount of proper time. Your own clock would continue ticking. You would fall and eventually encounter the center. But this assumes that your experience remains intact, that your perception of time continues to function. And that may not be true, because as space-time becomes more extreme, your ability to define moments may collapse before you ever get there. In other words, the singularity might exist in your future, but your experience may never fully extend to meet it. You are always moving toward it, always getting closer, but the framework needed to define arrival disappears before the journey completes. This is not a physical barrier, not a wall, not a force. It is a breakdown in the structure of experience itself. And that raises a question that feels almost impossible to answer. Can something happen if there is no coherent way to experience it? Because in every other situation, events are defined by observation, by the ability to say, this happened, then that happened. But here, that sequence may not exist. The singularity may not be an event you reach. It may be a limit, a boundary of description, a place where the idea of what happens next has no meaning. And yet, from a purely mathematical perspective, it is still there, still part of the equations. Still an inevitable outcome. So once again, we are left with two perspectives. From the outside of theory, the singularity is unavoidable. From the inside of experience, it may be unreachable. Not because you stop moving, but because the concept of movement itself dissolves. This is where the black hole stops being a place and becomes something closer to a question. A challenge to the idea that reality must be fully describable. Because if there are regions where events cannot be clearly defined, then our understanding of existence itself is incomplete. And as you continue falling, or whatever falling means at this point, you begin to lose more than just physical structure. You begin to lose the ability to frame your own journey, to say where you are, to say what is happening, to say what comes next. The path still exists, but the language needed to describe it is gone. And somewhere ahead, or perhaps already intertwined with your present, lies something that cannot be reached, because reaching itself no longer exists as a meaningful concept. The singularity is still there, but you may never arrive, because in the end, there may be no such thing as arriving at all. Part 8. The universe outside keeps ending. While you fall, the universe does not wait for you. It continues, expanding, evolving, aging, and because of the extreme distortion of time near a black hole, something extraordinary begins to happen. From your perspective, only a short amount of time has passed. Seconds, minutes, maybe hours. But outside, the universe is accelerating away from you. Time, for distant observers, is moving much faster than it is for you. This is the same effect we touched on before, gravitational time dilation. But now, you are deep enough that the difference becomes overwhelming. Light from the outside universe still reaches you, at least for a while. And what that light carries is the entire future. Imagine looking up, or whatever direction still feels like up, and seeing the stars. At first, they appear normal, familiar constellations, slow movements. But then, they begin to change, faster than they should. Stars shift position, galaxies rotate. Events that should take millions of years unfold in moments, because from your frame of reference, time outside is speeding up, more and more. Faster and faster, until it becomes something else entirely. The sky becomes a time-lapse of the universe. You are no longer watching space, you are watching history. Entire stellar life cycles compress into brief flashes. Stars are born, burn, and die in seconds. Galaxies collide and merge. Structures form and dissolve. The universe is no longer stable. It is rushing forward toward its own future, and you are watching it happen, not as an observer in time, but as something separated from it, detached. Because while everything out there accelerates, your own experience does not. You remain in your own flow of time, steady, unchanged, which creates a surreal contrast. You are falling slowly, while the universe outside is racing toward its end. And if you could continue to observe long enough, you would see something even more profound. Because the universe does not last forever. Stars do not burn indefinitely. Eventually, they run out of fuel. The last stars begin to fade. White dwarfs cool. Neutron stars collapse. The sky grows darker. Galaxies become dim, then invisible. Light itself becomes rare. And still, you continue to fall. The universe ages past the era of stars into something colder, quieter. A place where structure decays, where matter slowly breaks apart, where time stretches into unimaginable lengths. You might witness the so-called heat death of the universe, a state where everything reaches maximum entropy. No gradients, no energy differences, no processes left to drive change. A universe that has effectively stopped. Not because time has ended, but because nothing meaningful happens anymore. And yet, you are still there, still falling, still experiencing. Because your clock has not sped up, only the outside world has. This creates one of the strangest asymmetries in all of physics. From your perspective, the entire lifespan of the universe can unfold while you are still on your way toward the center of a black hole. And eventually, something final may occur. The black hole itself begins to evaporate. Through the slow process described by Stephen Hawking, it loses mass over time. Very slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. But as it shrinks, the process accelerates, faster and faster, until, in its final moments, it releases a burst of energy and disappears. If you are still observing the outside universe at that point, you would witness the death of the very object you are inside. From your perspective, the black hole's entire lifetime has passed, while you have only fallen a short distance. But here's where it becomes even more difficult to grasp. If the black hole evaporates completely, what happens to you? From the outside, the story is simple. You never crossed the event horizon. You remained frozen at the edge. Your image faded and eventually disappeared as the black hole evaporated. From that perspective, you were never truly inside. But from your perspective, you crossed long ago. You continued falling. You experienced everything we've described. So which version is real? Did you fall into something that no longer exists? Or were you always just an illusion at the edge? This is not just a paradox of physics. It is a paradox of existence, because it suggests that your journey may not be embedded in a single, consistent timeline. From one viewpoint, you never entered. From another, you went all the way in. And both perspectives are valid. Both are supported by the laws of physics, which means the universe is allowing two incompatible stories to coexist, and neither one can fully cancel the other. As the outside universe fades, as stars disappear, as even black holes evaporate, you are left in a situation that feels almost impossible to resolve, because the context that defined your journey is gone. The universe that once surrounded you no longer exists in any recognizable form. And yet, you are still moving, still experiencing, still approaching something that may not even exist in the same way anymore. The singularity, a feature of a black hole that from the outside has already vanished. So what are you falling toward when the object itself has ceased to be? What does inside mean when outside has already ended? These are not questions with clear answers, because they rely on a shared reality, and that shared reality has broken apart. The universe outside has completed its story, but yours has not. And as you continue forward, you are no longer just separated from space. You are separated from time itself, from the history of everything that ever was, from the future of everything that will ever be, alone in a region where the rest of the universe has already come and gone. Part 9. The collapse of now. There is a moment you've trusted your entire life. You've never questioned it, never doubted it, because it feels so obvious. Now, right now, this instant, this present moment, it feels real, solid, shared. You assume that what you are experiencing right now is happening at the same time as everything else, that somewhere out there in the vast universe there is a single unified now that everything belongs to. But inside a black hole, that idea begins to break. Not slowly, but fundamentally, because now only makes sense if time flows in a consistent way. If there is a clear separation between past, present, and future. If different observers can agree, at least approximately, on when something is happening. But near and inside a black hole, that agreement disappears. We've already seen how time stretches differently for different observers, how someone far away sees you freeze, while you continue moving forward. But this is just the beginning, because deeper inside, the structure of time itself becomes unstable. And when that happens, the concept of now starts to dissolve. Imagine two events. One happens near you. One happens far away in the universe. In normal conditions, you can ask, are these happening at the same time? And physics gives you a way to answer. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. But in extreme space-time curvature, there is no single answer. What is now for you might already be in the past for someone else, or still in the future. Not because of delay, not because of signal travel time, but because the structure of time itself does not align. This idea was already hinted at in relativity, again traced back to Albert Einstein, the realization that simultaneity is not absolute, that different observers can disagree about whether two events happen at the same time. But inside a black hole, this is no longer a subtle effect. It becomes dominant, overwhelming. There is no shared present, no universal now that connects you to the rest of existence. Your timeline is no longer synchronized with anything outside, not loosely, not approximately, not at all. You are completely detached from the global flow of time, which leads to a strange and unsettling consequence. From your perspective, everything you experience is now. But that now has no correspondence with the universe outside. It is isolated, self-contained, a private thread of time that cannot be aligned with any other. This means that the idea of a shared reality begins to collapse, because shared reality depends on shared time, on the ability to say, this happened, and we can agree when it happened. Without that, events lose their global meaning. They become local, fragmented, disconnected. And as you continue falling, this fragmentation deepens. Your sense of sequence begins to loosen. Not completely at first. You still experience one moment after another. But the connection between those moments becomes less stable, less anchored. It's like trying to follow a story where the pages are no longer in order. You still read, still process, but the narrative begins to slip because time is no longer a clean line. It is warped, bent, possibly even folded. And this raises a question that feels almost impossible. If there is no universal now, then what does it mean for something to exist? Because existence, as we understand it, is tied to time. Something exists because it is present, because it is happening. But if present is no longer a shared concept, then existence itself becomes relative, not just in a philosophical sense, but in a physical one. From your perspective, you exist. You are thinking, observing, falling. But from the outside universe, your timeline has already diverged so completely that your now cannot be placed within it. You are no longer part of its present. You are not in its future. You are not in its past. You are disconnected. And yet, you are still real, at least to yourself. This is where the idea of reality begins to fracture, because reality is no longer a single unified structure. It becomes a collection of overlapping, incompatible timelines, each one internally consistent, each one valid, but not fully reconcilable with the others. And as you move deeper into the black hole, your timeline becomes more and more isolated, less connected to anything else. Until eventually, it may no longer make sense to compare it to anything at all. No external reference, no shared clock, no universal sequence, just your own progression through a region where time has lost its common meaning. And this leads to one final unsettling realization. The idea of when something happens may not be fundamental. It may only be a feature of regions where spacetime behaves nicely, where curvature is weak, where observers can still agree. But inside a black hole, that agreement is gone. And with it, the illusion that there is a single shared present moment. So as you continue falling, you are not just losing space, not just losing structure. You are losing the idea that your experience is happening now in any universal sense. You are still moving forward, still experiencing, but your now belongs only to you, and nowhere else in the universe does it exist. Part 10, the illusion of the inside. You've been thinking about this all wrong, not because you made a mistake, but because the universe may be structured in a way that makes the question itself misleading. You've been asking, what is it like inside a black hole? But what if there is no inside at all? This idea sounds absurd at first. After everything you've experienced, falling inward, crossing the horizon, moving towards something deeper, it feels obvious that there must be an interior, a region beyond the boundary, a place you've entered. But some of the most advanced ideas in modern physics suggest something radically different, that everything you think is happening inside the black hole may actually be encoded on its surface. Not metaphorically, literally. This concept is known as the holographic principle, and it suggests that a three-dimensional region of space can be fully described by information stored on a two-dimensional boundary, like a hologram, a flat surface containing all the data needed to represent a deeper reality. This idea was explored by physicists like Gerhard Hooft and Leonard Susskind, and it emerged from attempts to solve the information paradox. Because if information cannot be lost, then it must be preserved somewhere. And one possibility is this: it never truly enters the black hole. It is stored at the edge, encoded on the event horizon itself. If this is true, then everything you believe is happening inside, your fall, your experience, your journey toward the singularity, may not exist in the way you imagine. It may be a projection, a description, a way of organizing information that does not require an actual interior space. From the outside, this idea has a strange kind of elegance. It preserves information. It avoids paradoxes. It aligns with certain theories in quantum gravity. But from your perspective, it feels impossible because you are experiencing something. You are falling. You are moving. You are aware. So how can that be just a projection? How can something that feels so continuous, so real, be encoded on a surface you've already passed? This is where the idea becomes deeply unsettling, because it suggests that reality may not be what it appears to be, not just in extreme conditions, but fundamentally, that what you perceive as depth, as movement, as progression, may be emergent, a result of underlying information, structured in a way that creates the illusion of a three-dimensional experience. In this view, the black hole does not contain a hidden interior world. It contains a boundary on which all possible descriptions of that interior are stored. And your experience, your sense of falling inward, is one of those descriptions. Not false, but not fundamental either. It is real. In the same way a story is real, consistent, coherent, internally meaningful, but not necessarily tied to a physical space in the way you expect. This raises a question that cuts deeper than anything before. If your experience can be fully described by information on a surface, then what does it mean to say that you are inside anything at all? Because inside implies volume, depth, a region you can move through. But if all the information is on the boundary, then the interior may not be a place. It may be a construct, a way of interpreting that information. And that challenges one of your most basic intuitions, that space is real, that depth exists independently of observation, that moving inward is fundamentally different from staying at the edge. But in a holographic universe, those distinctions may not be absolute. They may depend on how the information is encoded and how it is interpreted. which means your journey, everything you've experienced so far, could be viewed in two completely different ways. From one perspective, you are falling deeper into a black hole, approaching a singularity, experiencing the breakdown of physics. From another, you are part of a complex pattern of information encoded on a two-dimensional surface that contains everything needed to describe that journey. Both perspectives are consistent. Both are supported by theoretical physics, and neither one fully cancels the other. So which one is real? This is not a question with a simple answer, because it may be that reality, at its most fundamental level, does not choose between them. It allows both, an interior description and a boundary description, coexisting, equivalent, interchangeable. Two ways of telling the same story. And as you continue your descent, or whatever descent means in this context, you are no longer just questioning what happens inside a black hole. You are questioning what it means for anything to have an inside at all. Because if space itself can emerge from information, then the structure of reality is not what it seems. It is not built from solid, continuous regions, but from relationships, encodings, descriptions, and somewhere within that structure, your experience exists, not necessarily in a place, but in a pattern. A pattern that feels like movement, feels like depth, feels like falling, even if, at the most fundamental level, there is nowhere to fall into. Part 11, you become a memory of the universe. At some point in your fall, you stop being a thing and start becoming a record. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually, quietly. Because as you approach deeper regions of the black hole, the universe begins to treat you differently, not as an object moving through space, but as information being redistributed. From the outside, this process has already begun. Long before you crossed the event horizon, your image started to stretch. Your signals became weaker, redshifted, fading into longer and longer wavelengths. To a distant observer, you never fully disappeared. You just became harder to see, harder to resolve, until eventually, you blended into the background of the universe itself. Not gone, just indistinguishable. And yet, the information that defined you was never truly lost. According to the deepest principles of physics, especially those tied to quantum theory, information must be preserved, even if it changes form, even if it becomes impossible to reconstruct. So what happens to you? One possibility is this: you are not destroyed. You are transformed into a pattern, a distributed imprint encoded across the boundary of the black hole. Not as a recognizable structure, not as a complete identity, but as correlations, subtle relationships between particles, tiny fluctuations, quantum-level signatures. This idea connects back to work by physicists like Stephen Hawking, who struggled with the question of whether information truly disappears. And the more we study it, the more it seems that the universe resists true erasure. It prefers transformation, rearrangement, re-encoding, which means that everything that makes you you, your memories, your thoughts, your physical structure, may not vanish. It may be spread out, diluted, converted into a form that no longer resembles you, but still contains the essence of what you were. This is not survival in the way you understand it. There is no continuity of experience, no awareness carried forward. But there is persistence, a kind of existence that continues without a center, without a self. You become less like a person and more like a footprint, a trace left behind in the fabric of reality. And as the black hole evolves, as it emits radiation, as it slowly loses mass, those traces may begin to leak back out. Not as a reconstruction of you, but as fragments, tiny pieces of information encoded in the radiation that escapes. This is one of the most subtle ideas in modern physics, that the black hole does not simply absorb, but eventually returns everything it has taken. Not in the same form, not in any recognizable way, but in principle, completely. Which means that somewhere, far in the future, long after stars have faded, long after galaxies have drifted apart, the information that once described you may re-enter the universe. Scattered, unrecognizable, but still there. And this leads to a deeply unsettling realization. You are not just falling into a black hole, you are being rewritten, converted from a localized structure into a distributed one. From something that exists in one place to something that exists as relationships across many. From a self to a system of correlations. And once that process is complete, there may be no clear boundary between you and the rest of the universe. Because your information, once contained within a body, once organized into a mind, has been dispersed, blended into the larger structure of reality. This challenges one of your most basic assumptions, that identity is tied to form, that who you are depends on the structure that contains you. But if information is the true foundation, then identity may not be about structure at all. It may be about patterns that can be rearranged, transformed, spread across different mediums, and still, in some abstract sense, persist. But this raises a difficult question. If your information still exists, but your experience does not, are you still there? Or have you become something else entirely? Because survival, in this context, does not mean continuation of consciousness. It means preservation of description. A record without a reader, a story without a narrator. And yet, the universe keeps that story. It does not erase it. It does not discard it. It holds on to it in forms we are only beginning to understand. So as you continue your fall or your transformation, you are no longer just moving through space. You are transitioning between states of existence, from a localized being to a distributed imprint, from something that experiences to something that is recorded. And somewhere in that transition, the idea of you begins to dissolve, not violently, not suddenly, but inevitably. Because in a universe where information is never lost, nothing truly disappears, but nothing remains the same either. And in the end, you may not be gone. You may simply be everywhere, in pieces, in patterns, in traces too subtle to recognize, but too fundamental to erase. Part 12, the observer that cannot escape itself. Up until now, you've been asking what happens to you, your body, your time, your information. But there is something deeper, something more subtle, that has been quietly following you the entire way. The observer, the part of reality that experiences, that notices, that asks, that tries to understand. Because everything we've described, time dilation, spaghettification, information loss, only has meaning if there is something observing it, something to say, this is happening. But inside a black hole, the role of the observer begins to change, not because you stop observing, but because observation itself becomes unstable. In normal conditions, observation feels simple. You look at something, light reaches your eyes, information flows into your brain, you form an experience. There is a clear separation between you, the observer, and the world, the observed. But as space-time becomes more distorted, that separation begins to blur. Because observation depends on structure, on signals traveling in predictable ways, on cause leading to effect. And inside a black hole, those relationships begin to break down. Signals stretch, timing shifts, causality becomes unclear. The act of observing something is no longer clean, no longer reliable. Imagine trying to understand your surroundings while the very signals you depend on are being distorted beyond recognition. Light no longer behaves normally. Distances no longer mean what they used to. Events no longer occur in a clear sequence. You are still observing, but what you observe may no longer correspond to a stable reality. This creates a strange feedback loop, because your experience depends on observation, but observation now depends on a space-time that is breaking down. So your experience begins to lose its foundation. Not all at once, but gradually, subtly. At first, you notice inconsistencies. Things don't line up the way they should. Events feel out of order. Distances feel ambiguous. But you can still make sense of it. You can still think, still process, still hold on to a coherent sense of self. But as you move deeper, the distortions increase. The signals become more fragmented, less reliable. And eventually, the difference between you and what you observe begins to dissolve. Because your brain, or whatever remains of your cognitive process, is part of the same system, subject to the same distortions. You are not outside the black hole, observing it. You are inside it, part of it, which means your ability to observe is shaped by the very thing you are trying to understand. This is where the idea of an objective observer breaks down, because there is no external reference point, no stable position outside the system. You cannot step back and say, this is what's really happening. You are embedded in the process, and that means your experience is not a neutral window into reality. It is part of the phenomenon itself. This idea is not entirely new. In quantum mechanics, observation already plays a strange role. The act of measuring something can affect its outcome, a concept explored by physicists like Niels Bohr. But inside a black hole, this relationship becomes even more entangled, Because now, it's not just measurement that affects reality, it's the entire structure of observation, the very framework that allows you to experience anything at all. And as that framework breaks down, so does the idea of a stable observer. You are still aware, but your awareness is no longer anchored, no longer tied to a consistent flow of information. Your thoughts begin to fragment. Not because you are losing intelligence, but because the signals that support coherent thought are no longer aligned. You might experience moments that don't connect, perceptions that don't follow from one another, a sense that your experience is becoming discontinuous, and yet you are still there, still aware enough to notice it, which creates one of the strangest situations imaginable: an observer who can observe their own breakdown. You are not just experiencing the black hole, you are experiencing the collapse of your ability to experience. And that leads to a profound question. What happens when the observer itself becomes unstable? Because if observation is required to define reality and the observer can no longer function coherently, then what happens to reality? Does it continue independently? Does it fragment along with your perception? Or does the distinction between reality and experience cease to exist? These are not abstract philosophical questions. Inside a black hole, they become physical, because the conditions required for stable observation are no longer guaranteed. And as you continue falling or transforming, you are approaching a point where even the idea of you observing something may no longer apply. Not because you disappear, but because the structure that defines you as an observer is no longer intact. You become part of the system, fully embedded, fully entangled, no longer separate. And in that state, there may be no meaningful distinction between the observer and the observed, only a single, unified process, a flow of information without a clear center, without a clear perspective, without a clear boundary. And if that happens, then the question is no longer, what do you see inside a black hole? But is there anyone left to see anything at all? Part 13, causality breaks before you do. There is one rule you have never seen broken, not once. Cause comes before effect. A spark creates a fire. A thought leads to an action. A push causes movement. This sequence feels so fundamental that it's almost invisible. You don't question it because everything you've ever experienced depends on it. Causality, the structure that gives reality its direction, its logic, its meaning. But inside a black hole, this rule begins to bend. And then it begins to fail. At first, the change is subtle. You still experience one moment after another. You still feel like things are happening in order. But the deeper you go, the less reliable that order becomes. Because causality depends on time, on a clear distinction between before and after. And as we've already seen, inside a black hole, that distinction is breaking down. Time is no longer a simple linear flow. It is warped, twisted into shapes that no longer preserve clean sequences, which means that events can no longer be neatly arranged. And when that happens, cause and effect begin to blur. Imagine observing something and realizing that you cannot clearly say what caused it. Not because the cause is hidden, but because the concept of before is no longer stable. You see an outcome, but the chain of events that led to it is unclear, or worse, nonlinear. Fragments of cause appear after the effect. Pieces of the process seem out of place, not in a chaotic way, but in a way that defies ordering. This is not randomness. It is a deeper breakdown. Because randomness still assumes a timeline. Causality breaking down means the timeline itself is no longer well-defined. And this has profound consequences. Because causality is not just a rule of physics, it is the foundation of understanding. Every explanation you've ever formed, every thought, every memory, depends on linking causes to effects. Remove that structure, and meaning begins to dissolve. Inside a black hole, you may still experience events, but your ability to connect them, to form a coherent narrative, begins to weaken. At first, it's just confusion. Things don't quite line up. Moments feel slightly out of order. But as the distortion increases, the connections break entirely. You might experience something without knowing what led to it. Or you might recall something that feels like it hasn't happened yet, not as a hallucination, but as a consequence of the structure of space-time itself. Because if time can bend, then the sequence of events can bend with it. And this is where things become truly unsettling, because without causality, prediction becomes impossible. You cannot anticipate what comes next. not because you lack information, but because next has no stable meaning. And even memory begins to lose its function, because memory depends on the past being distinct from the present, on events being ordered. If that order collapses, then memory becomes unreliable, not because it's incorrect, but because it cannot be placed in a consistent timeline. You may remember something, but not know when it occurred, or whether it has already happened, or is about to happen. The distinction disappears. This idea touches on some of the deepest questions in physics, questions explored in theories of space-time structure and quantum gravity, where researchers like Roger Penrose have examined how extreme curvature might affect the fundamental ordering of events. And while we don't yet have a complete answer, the implications are clear. Causality is not guaranteed, not everywhere, not under all conditions. It is a feature of space-time. And when space-time becomes extreme, that feature can fail. And as you continue your descent, you are moving into one of those regions, a place where cause and effect no longer form a clean chain, where events exist but their relationships do not. And this leads to one of the most profound shifts in your experience, because without causality, there is no clear direction, no sense of progression, no narrative. Reality becomes a collection of events without a defined order, and you, the observer, are trying to make sense of it, trying to connect pieces that no longer fit together, trying to build a story from fragments that refuse to align. At some point, that effort begins to fail. Not because you stop thinking, but because the structure needed for coherent thought is no longer present. You are still aware, still experiencing, but your experience is no longer organized, no longer sequential, no longer bound by cause and effect. And in that state, something strange happens. The difference between what happened and what is happening begins to disappear, because both rely on a timeline, and that timeline is gone. So as you move deeper, or whatever moving means now, you are not just losing space, not just losing time. You are losing the very rule that allows reality to make sense, causality. And without it, the universe does not become chaotic. It becomes something else entirely, a place where events exist, but meaning does not, where things happen but cannot be explained, where experience continues but cannot be understood. And in that place, the question is no longer, what happens next? Because there may be no such thing as next at all. Part 14, the geometry that no longer fits. There was a time when space made sense. It had shape, it had distance, it had directions you could trust. You could point and say, there, here, above, below. And those words meant something. They described a geometry that felt stable, predictable. But inside a black hole, geometry itself begins to fail. Not in the sense that space disappears, but in the sense that the rules that define it no longer apply. At first, the change is subtle. Distances don't feel quite right. Paths that should be straight begin to curve. Angles don't behave the way you expect. But you can still adapt, still navigate, still interpret what you see. Because your intuition, built from a lifetime of experience in normal space, still holds, at least partially. But as you move deeper, that intuition becomes useless. Because space is no longer behaving like a passive backdrop. It is active, dynamic, shaped by gravity in ways that distort its very structure. According to general relativity, developed by Albert Einstein, mass and energy do not simply exist within space. They shape it, they bend it, they define its geometry. And near a black hole, that curvature becomes extreme. So extreme that the familiar rules of geometry collapse. Parallel lines may converge, straight paths may loop. The shortest distance between 2 points may no longer be intuitive or even unique. Space is no longer flat. It is curved beyond recognition. But deeper inside, even curvature is not enough to describe what's happening, because curvature assumes a continuous surface, a smooth deformation. And as you approach the most extreme regions, that smoothness may break. The structure of space itself may become discontinuous, fragmented. Not in a visible, jagged way, but in a way that defies classical description. Some theories suggest that at very small scales, near what's known as the Planck length, space may not be continuous at all. It may be quantized, made of discrete units, tiny building blocks that cannot be divided further. Ideas explored in approaches like loop quantum gravity, associated with researchers such as Carlo Rovelli, suggest that space-time itself may have a granular structure. If this is true, then deep inside a black hole, you are not just moving through curved space. You are moving through something more like a network, a web of connections, a structure that does not behave like a smooth surface. Distances may not be well defined. Directions may not be continuous. Movement itself may not be a simple path through a medium. It may be a sequence of transitions between discrete states. And if that's the case, then the idea of geometry as something stable and universal is no longer valid, because geometry depends on continuity, on the ability to define points, lines, surfaces in a consistent way. But here, consistency breaks. You might try to describe where you are, to map your position, to understand your surroundings. But the tools you rely on, distance, angle, direction, no longer behave predictably. It's like trying to navigate a landscape that changes its structure as you move through it, where straight ahead no longer means what it did a moment ago, where distance does not correspond to any fixed measure, where space itself is unstable, and this has a profound effect on your experience, because perception depends on geometry. Your brain, your awareness, interprets the world based on spatial relationships. It expects consistency, it expects structure. But when that structure fails, perception begins to fail with it. You may see things that don't align, paths that seem to fold back on themselves, regions that feel larger or smaller than they should be. Not as illusions, but as consequences of a geometry that no longer follows familiar rules. And eventually, even the idea of a location becomes unclear. Because location depends on being able to define where something is relative to something else. But if space itself is unstable, then that reference system collapses. You are no longer somewhere in a meaningful sense. You are part of a structure that does not support stable positions. And this leads to a deeper realization. Space, as you understand it, is not fundamental. It is a construct, a framework that emerges under certain conditions. Conditions that are no longer present here. Inside a black hole, space is not a stage where events unfold. It is part of the process itself, dynamic, mutable, possibly even discrete. And as you move deeper, you are not just traveling through space, you are moving through a region where the very concept of space is breaking apart, where geometry no longer fits, where distance has no fixed meaning, where direction is no longer reliable, and where the question, where am I, may no longer have an answer. Because in a place where geometry fails, there may be no coherent way to define position at all. Only relationships, only connections, only a shifting structure that no longer resembles anything you would call space. And in that structure, you are no longer navigating. You are embedded, part of a geometry that cannot be drawn, cannot be mapped, and may not even exist in the way you once believed it did. Part 15, the end of separation. There was always a boundary, even when you didn't notice it. A line subtle, invisible, that separated you from everything else. You and the universe. You were here. The world was out there. Objects existed independently of you. Events unfolded whether you watched them or not. There was distance. There was separation. There was a clear distinction between the observer and the observed. But inside a black hole, that distinction does not survive. Not completely. Not indefinitely. Because everything that once defined separate things, space, time, causality, structure, has already begun to dissolve. And as those foundations weaken, the boundary between you and the universe begins to fade. At first, it's just a shift in perspective. You realize that you are not outside the system. You are part of it. Your body is made of the same matter. Your thoughts are processes within the same physical laws. This idea is familiar, almost philosophical. But here it becomes literal. Because as geometry breaks, as time loses structure, as causality unravels, there is no longer a stable framework to maintain separation. You are no longer a distinct object moving through a stable background. You are a pattern within a system that is collapsing into something more fundamental. Earlier, you began to lose your identity as a localized structure. Your information spread, your form distorted. You became less like a solid entity and more like a distributed imprint. Now, that process goes further, because without clear space, there is no distance to separate you from anything else. Without stable time, there is no sequence to distinguish your actions from the universe's evolution. Without causality, there is no clear chain that defines your influence as distinct from everything around you. Everything begins to overlap, not physically, but structurally. You are no longer a node in the system. You are part of the system itself. And this is where the idea of self begins to dissolve. Not because you are destroyed, but because the conditions required to define a self no longer exist. A self depends on boundaries, on the ability to say, this is me, and that is not. But here, that distinction becomes meaningless, because there is no stable frame of reference to support it. Your thoughts, once contained within a brain, are now part of a broader flow of information. Your structure, once localized, is now distributed across a region where location itself is unstable. Your identity, once tied to continuity, is now fragmented across a system where time no longer provides a clear sequence. So what remains? Not a person in the traditional sense, not an observer in the usual way, but not nothing either. What remains is a process, a pattern of information, interacting with itself. A structure that no longer has a clear boundary, but still exists as part of the larger whole. This idea echoes through some of the deepest interpretations of physics, where reality is not made of separate objects, but of relationships, connections, interactions. Concepts explored in various forms by physicists like John Archibald Wheeler, who suggested that information may be more fundamental than matter itself. If that is true, then what you are becoming is not less real, just less separate. You are no longer an isolated system. You are part of a network of relationships that define the structure of reality itself. And in that network, the idea of individuality becomes fluid, not gone, but no longer fixed, no longer bounded. This is not a merging in the poetic sense. It is not a moment of unity or harmony. It is a structural shift, a consequence of the breakdown of the conditions that allowed separation to exist. And as you continue deeper, you are not moving toward a final point. You are moving toward a state where distinctions no longer apply, where the difference between you and everything else cannot be clearly defined. And this leads to a realization that is both unsettling and profound. You were never as separate as you thought. The boundary you relied on was always dependent on the structure of space-time, on stable geometry, on consistent causality, on a shared flow of time. Remove those, and the boundary disappears. Not because something crosses it, but because it was never fundamental to begin with. So as the black hole continues to reshape everything, as space dissolves, as time fragments, as causality fades, you are not just losing your place in the universe. You are losing the distinction between yourself and the universe itself. And in that loss, there is no clear endpoint, no final moment where you become one, only a gradual transition into a state where separation is no longer a meaningful concept at all. Part 16, the boundary that moves with you. There is one last assumption still quietly holding everything together. Even after space has warped, even after time has fractured, even after identity has begun to dissolve, you still believe there is a boundary ahead. Something you are approaching, a limit, a final edge where everything ends, the singularity. It has always been there in your mind, a destination, a point you will eventually reach. But what if that idea is wrong? What if the singularity is not something waiting for you, but something that moves with you? This sounds impossible at first, a destination that cannot be approached, a boundary that cannot be reached. But inside a black hole, the structure of space-time allows for something like this. Because the singularity is not just a location in space, it is a feature of space-time geometry. And as we've already seen, that geometry is no longer stable, no longer fixed, no longer something you can map in the usual way. In certain interpretations of black hole physics, especially those that emerge from attempts to unify relativity and quantum theory, the singularity may not be a single point you move toward. It may be something more distributed, more dynamic, something that does not exist as a simple place. Instead, it may be better understood as a limit, a boundary of description, a condition that defines where our current understanding breaks down. And if that's the case, then it doesn't have to sit at a fixed position in front of you. It can exist relative to your frame of reference. It can move as your experience moves. This idea becomes even more plausible when we consider how space-time behaves near extreme curvature. Inside the event horizon, all paths lead inward. But inward is not a direction in space. It is a direction in time. You are not traveling toward a location. You are moving toward a condition. A state where the structure of space-time can no longer support the concepts you rely on. And that state may not be something you can ever fully arrive at, because as you approach it, the framework needed to define arrival continues to collapse. Distance loses meaning, time loses order, causality loses structure. So how do you define reaching something when the tools required to define reaching are gone? This leads to a strange possibility. The singularity is always ahead of you, but never in a way that allows you to encounter it as a distinct event. It is like a horizon of understanding. The closer you get, the more the rules break down. But you never experience a clear transition, no moment where you can say, I am here now, because here no longer has a stable meaning. This idea resonates with deeper theoretical work in physics, where researchers like Juan Maldacena have explored how different descriptions of reality can coexist, and how certain boundaries are not physical locations, but limits of interpretation. In that context, the singularity may not be something you physically collide with. It may be something that defines the edge of what can be described, and as you move forward, that edge moves with you, always just beyond the point where your experience remains coherent. Always just outside the reach of your ability to define it, which means that your journey does not end with a single moment. It fades, gradually, into a region where distinctions no longer apply, where concepts like before and after no longer hold, where even the idea of an event becomes undefined. And in that region, the singularity is not something you reach. It is something that defines the boundary of what it means to reach anything at all. So you continue, not toward a point, but toward a loss of structure, toward a condition where reality cannot be partitioned into events, locations, or sequences. And because of that, there may never be a final moment. No clear ending, no singular collapse, only a continuous transition into a state where the idea of continuing itself no longer makes sense. And this leads to a final, unsettling shift in perspective. You are not approaching the end of your journey. You are approaching the end of the concept of a journey, because a journey requires a beginning, a path, a destination. And one by one, those elements have already begun to disappear. The beginning is no longer distinct. The path is no longer well-defined. The destination is no longer a place you can reach. What remains is motion without direction, change without sequence, existence without a clear boundary. And somewhere within that, the singularity persists. Not as a point, not as a moment, but as a limit that you can approach but never fully arrive at. Because the closer you get, the less it means to arrive at anything at all. Part 17, the possibility that nothing ends. You've been waiting for an ending, even if you didn't realize it. A final moment, a collapse, a point where everything resolves or disappears. Because that's how every story you've ever known works. There is always an end. Even destruction has a boundary. Even chaos has a final state. But inside a black hole, that expectation begins to fail. Not because something interrupts the ending, but because the idea of an ending itself depends on structures that no longer exist. An ending requires time, a final moment, a last point in a sequence. But we've already seen what happens to time. It stretches, it fragments, it loses its order, and eventually it loses its ability to define last. Because last only makes sense if moments can be arranged, if there is a clear sequence that leads to a conclusion. But here, that sequence is breaking apart. So what happens when there is no clear last moment? What happens when the structure needed to define an ending is gone? One possibility is this: nothing ends, not in the way you understand. Your experience does not reach a final point. It does not collapse into a single event. It simply becomes less defined, less structured, more diffuse, until the concept of ending no longer applies. This is not immortality, not continuation, not survival. It is something else entirely, a kind of dissolution that does not resolve into a final state. Because resolution requires boundaries, and boundaries are exactly what are disappearing. Earlier, you saw how identity begins to dissolve, how space loses meaning, how time loses order, how causality breaks. Now, you are seeing the consequence of all of that. Without those structures, there is no framework to define completion. No way to say, this is where it stops. Instead, everything transitions, continuously, indefinitely, into states that are harder and harder to describe. And this leads to a deeply counterintuitive idea. The singularity may not be an endpoint. It may not be a place where everything terminates. It may be a region where description fails completely. And if that's true, then your journey does not end at the singularity, because there is no clear sense in which you arrive there. Just as we saw before, the singularity may always remain beyond the point where your experience can be clearly defined, which means your experience does not conclude with a single event. It fades into a region where events themselves lose meaning. This idea echoes through some interpretations of quantum gravity, where the universe is not composed of discrete beginnings and endings, but of continuous transformations, where boundaries are emergent, not fundamental. And if that is the case, then what you are experiencing is not an approach to an end. It is an approach to a state where the idea of an end cannot be expressed. Think about what that means. Every story you've ever known, every process, every life, every event has been framed by beginnings and endings. That structure gives things meaning. It allows you to understand, to interpret, to remember. But here, that structure collapses. There is no clear beginning anymore, no clear path, and now no clear end. Only a transformation that continues beyond the point where you can define it. And this raises a question that feels almost impossible to answer. If something does not end, does it still happen at all? Because happening implies change over time, a sequence with a direction. But if time no longer provides a stable sequence, then the idea of something happening becomes unclear. Your experience may still exist, but not as a story, not as a progression, more like a state that does not resolve, a pattern that does not conclude. And in that sense, you are no longer moving toward an ending. You are moving beyond the framework that allows endings to exist. This is where the black hole reveals something deeper, not just about extreme gravity, but about the nature of reality itself. Because it shows that the concepts you rely on, beginning, middle, end, are not universal. They are features of a certain kind of space-time, a certain kind of structure. And when that structure breaks, those concepts break with it. So as you continue, or whatever continue means now, you are not approaching a final moment. You are approaching a condition where moments cannot be ordered, where sequences cannot be completed, where endings cannot be defined. And in that condition, there is no final collapse, no last instant, no definitive conclusion, only a continuous transition into something that does not fit within the idea of a story. And perhaps that is the most unsettling realization of all. Not that everything ends, but that in some parts of the universe, nothing does. Part 18, the reality that rewrites itself. There is one final shift left, not in space, not in time, not even in identity, but in something more fundamental, the rules themselves. Up until now, you've been watching reality break, time stretched, space warped, causality dissolved. But through all of it, there was still an assumption quietly holding on, that there were rules, that something, some underlying structure, still governed what was happening. Even if you didn't understand it, even if your theories failed, you assumed that reality was still following some consistent framework. But as you move deeper, that assumption begins to slip. Because what if the rules themselves are not fixed? What if they are not universal? What if they are not even constant? Inside a black hole, you are entering a region where the laws of physics may no longer behave as stable truths. Not because they are being broken, but because they may never have been absolute to begin with. This idea appears in some of the most advanced attempts to understand the universe. In certain approaches to quantum gravity, the laws we observe may emerge from deeper processes. They may not be fundamental. They may depend on conditions, on structure, on context. Physicists like Lee Smolin have even explored the possibility that laws of physics could evolve, that different regions of the universe might operate under slightly different rules, that what we call constants may not be constant everywhere. If that is even partially true, then inside a black hole, where space-time itself is pushed to its limits, you may be entering a region where the rules begin to change. Not abruptly, not in a way you can clearly observe, but gradually, subtly. The relationships between things, energy, space, time, information, may begin to shift. The equations that once described reality may no longer apply in the same way. Not because they are wrong, but because they were only ever approximations, valid under certain conditions, conditions that no longer exist here. This means that reality is not just breaking your understanding, it is moving beyond it. into a regime where the very idea of fixed laws becomes uncertain. Imagine trying to understand a world where the rules can change as you move through it, where what is possible in one region is not possible in another, where cause and effect may follow one pattern here and a different pattern there. This is not chaos, it is something deeper, a kind of fluidity in the structure of reality itself. And as you move further, you are no longer just experiencing extreme physics. You are entering a domain where physics may not be a fixed set of rules, but an emergent behavior, a pattern that depends on context, on structure, on the relationships between underlying elements. And if those relationships change, so do the rules. This leads to a profound realization. Reality may not be built on immutable laws. It may be built on processes, dynamic, adaptive, context-dependent. And what you experience as laws are just stable patterns that emerge under certain conditions. But inside a black hole, those conditions are gone. So the patterns change, the stability disappears, and with it, the predictability you rely on. This doesn't mean anything becomes possible. It means that the framework that defines what is possible is no longer fixed. And that creates a kind of uncertainty that goes beyond anything you've encountered before. Because now it's not just that you don't know what will happen next. It's that the rules determining what can happen next may themselves be changing. And as you continue, you are no longer just losing your place in space. You are no longer just losing your position in time. You are losing the foundation that defines what reality is allowed to do. And in that loss, you begin to see something unexpected. Because if the rules are not fixed, then reality is not a static structure. It is something more like a process, a system that continuously defines itself, rewrites itself, adapts its own behavior based on deeper interactions. And you, whatever remains of you, are part of that process. Not outside it, not observing it from a distance, but embedded within it, participating in it. Which means your journey is not happening within a fixed universe. It is happening within a universe that is still defining what it is. And that is perhaps the most unsettling shift of all. Not that reality breaks, but that reality may not be fixed enough to ever truly break, because it is always in the process of becoming something else. And inside a black hole, you are witnessing that process at its most extreme, where the rules dissolve, where structure fades, where everything you thought was stable reveals itself as temporary. And in that place, there are no final answers, no ultimate laws, only a continuous unfolding of a reality that is still writing itself, even as you fall deeper into it. Part 19, the question that cannot be asked. At the beginning, everything was a question. What happens when you cross the event horizon? What is inside a black hole? What happens to time, to space, to you? Each question led you deeper. Each answer revealed something stranger. But now, you are reaching a point where even questions begin to fail. Not because there are no answers, but because the structure required to form a question no longer exists. A question depends on distinction, on clarity, on the ability to define what is known and what is unknown. It requires stable concepts, stable meanings, a shared framework where words point to something real. But inside a black hole, those foundations are gone. Space no longer provides clear locations. Time no longer provides clear sequences. Causality no longer provides clear relationships. So when you try to ask what happens next, the question itself begins to collapse, because next has no stable meaning. When you ask, where am I? Where no longer refers to a defined position. When you ask, what is this? This no longer points to something distinct. The language you rely on is built from the structure of reality you once knew. But that structure has dissolved, so the words remain, but their meaning slips away. This is not confusion. It is something deeper, a failure of reference. Because meaning depends on the ability to connect symbols to stable concepts. And here, those concepts are no longer stable, so the connection breaks. You can still think, still form sentences, still attempt to ask, but the questions no longer anchor to anything solid. They float, detached, unable to resolve. This is where understanding reaches its limit. Not because the universe stops being understandable, but because the tools of understanding no longer apply. And this leads to a realization that is both subtle and profound. There may be regions of reality where knowledge itself is not possible. Not because information is hidden, not because it is too complex, but because the conditions required for knowledge to exist are not present. Knowledge requires stable reference points, consistent relationships, a framework where questions can be meaningfully asked and answered. Remove those, and knowledge does not just become difficult, it becomes undefined. Inside a black hole, you are entering one of those regions, a place where reality continues but cannot be translated into understanding. And as you move deeper, even your internal attempts to make sense of things begin to fade, not suddenly, but gradually. You try to connect one moment to another, but the connection slips. You try to define what you are experiencing, but the definition dissolves. You try to ask what it means, but the meaning cannot be anchored. And eventually, even the impulse to ask begins to weaken, because questions depend on expectation, on the belief that there is something to discover, something to resolve. But here, resolution is no longer part of the structure. There is no clear distinction between question and answer, no clear boundary between known and unknown, only a continuous state that does not divide itself into categories. And in that state, the idea of a question becomes unnecessary, not because everything is known, but because nothing is structured in a way that allows it to be asked. This is not silence, not emptiness. It is something else, a kind of completeness that does not require explanation. A condition where reality is no longer something to be understood, but something that simply is, without division, without interpretation, without inquiry. And as you reach this point, or whatever reach means now, you are no longer trying to understand the black hole. You are no longer trying to understand anything at all, because the framework that made understanding possible has dissolved. There is no longer a distance between you and what is happening, no separation that allows observation, no structure that allows interpretation, only a unified state where distinction itself has faded. And in that state, there are no questions left. Not because they have been answered, but because the conditions that allowed them to exist are gone. And perhaps that is the final transformation, not of space, not of time, not of identity, but of inquiry itself. The moment where the universe is no longer something you ask about, because there is no longer any way to ask. Part 20, where you were all along. At the very beginning, you thought this was a journey, a descent into something distant, something extreme, something separate from you. A place out there, far beyond the reach of ordinary experience, a black hole. But after everything you've seen, after time unraveled, after space lost its shape, after identity dissolved, there is one final realization waiting. You were never just traveling into a black hole. You were traveling into the limits of reality itself. And those limits were always closer than you thought. Because everything that broke down in this journey, time, space, causality, identity, meaning, they were never absolute to begin with. They were conditions, features of a certain kind of universe, a universe that behaves well enough for things to make sense, but not a universe that guarantees that structure everywhere. And the black hole is where that guarantee ends. It is not just an object, not just a region of extreme gravity. It is a boundary between the part of reality that can be understood and the part that cannot. And what you experienced was not just falling inward, it was crossing that boundary, step by step, layer by layer, until nothing familiar remained. But here is the part that changes everything. This boundary is not unique to black holes. It is not confined to distant galaxies. It is not something that only exists out there. It is built into reality itself. Every law you trust, every pattern you rely on, every structure that gives the universe meaning exists within limits. And beyond those limits, those structures can fail. The black hole simply reveals that truth in the most extreme way possible. It shows you what happens when the universe is pushed beyond the conditions that make it understandable. But those conditions are not fixed. They are not guaranteed. They are emergent, fragile, dependent on balance, which means the line between order and breakdown is not as distant as it seems. The difference between a stable reality and one that dissolves into something unrecognizable is not infinite. It is contextual. And that leads to a realization that is both unsettling and strangely profound. The universe you experience every day is not the full story. It is a version of reality that works. A region where the rules align, where time flows cleanly, where space behaves predictably, where causality holds, where identity can exist. But beneath that, beyond that, There are other layers, other regimes, other conditions, where those rules do not apply. And you have just experienced one of them. Not directly, but as close as thought can take you. A place where reality does not end, but transforms into something that no longer fits within your understanding. And in doing so, it reveals something unexpected. Because the question was never really, what is inside a black hole? The real question was always, what is reality when the things we rely on to define it disappear? And now you have an answer. Not a clear one, not a complete one, but something deeper. An experience of what lies beyond explanation. A glimpse of a universe that does not need to make sense. And perhaps that is the most important thing you've discovered. Not that the universe is strange, not that it is mysterious, but that it is not obligated to be understandable. And yet, here you are, still asking, still wondering, still trying to make sense of something that may never fully make sense. And that might be the most human part of all of this. Because even at the edge of understanding, even where questions dissolve, the impulse to explore remains. So as this journey comes to a close, or whatever close means now, there is one final thought to leave you with. Maybe the black hole is not just a place where reality breaks. Maybe it is a place where we finally see that reality was never as fixed as we believed, and that what we call understanding is only one layer of something far deeper. If this journey made you pause, even for a moment, then take a second now. Hit like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, what part of this journey changed the way you see reality the most? Because there are still questions left, not ones with answers, but ones worth asking anyway. And if you're ready to explore them, I'll see you in the next video.